Hey everybody, welcome to day 2 of our virtual book club. Just a friendly reminder, we are reading White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and today we are going to be reading chapter 2. Now chapter 2 is about 3 times longer than chapter 1, so I'm probably going to break the reading into 2 or 3 videos just to make it a little bit easier for you guys to digest, and that way you can sort of watch it when you have the time. So let's go ahead and begin. We are on chapter 2, Racism and White Supremacy. Chapter 2, Racism and White Supremacy. Many of us have been taught to believe that there are distinct biological and genetic differences between races. This biology accounts for visual differences such as skin color, hair texture, and eye shape, and traits that we believe we see such as sexuality, athleticism, or mathematical ability. The idea of race as a biological construct makes it easy to believe that many of the divisions we see in society are natural. But race, like gender, is socially constructed. The differences we see with our eyes, differences such as hair texture and eye color, are superficial and emerge as adaptations of geography. Under the skin, there is no true biological race. The external characteristics that we use to define race are unreliable indicators of genetic variation between any two people. However, the belief that race and the differences associated with it are biological is deep-seated. To challenge the belief in race as biology, we need to understand the social and economic investments that drove science to organize society and its resources along racial lines and why the organization is so enduring. Social construction of race in the United States. Freedom and equality, regardless of religion or class status, were radical new ideas when the United States was formed. At the same time, the U.S. economy was based on the abduction and enslavement of African American people, the displacement and genocide of the indigenous people, and the annexation of Mexican lands. Further, the colonizers who came were not free of their own cultural conditioning. They brought with them deeply internalized patterns of domination and submission. The tension between the noble ideology of equality and the cruel reality of genocide, enslavement, and colonization had to be reconciled. Thomas Jefferson, who himself owned hundreds of enslaved people, and others turned to science. Jefferson suggested that there were natural differences between the races and asked scientists to find them. If science could prove that black people were naturally and inherently inferior, he saw indigenous people as culturally deficient, a shortcoming that could be remediated. There would be no contradiction between our professed ideals and our actual practices. There were, of course, enormous economic interests in justifying enslavement and colonization. Race science was driven by these social and economic interests, which came to establish cultural norms and legal rulings that legitimized racism and the privileged status of those defined as white. Drawing on the work of Europeans before them, American scientists began searching for the answers to perceived inferiority of non-Anglo groups. Illustrating the power of our questions to shape the knowledge we validate, these scientists didn't ask, "Are blacks and others inferior?" They asked, "Why are blacks and others inferior?" In less than a century, Jefferson's suggestion of racial difference became commonly accepted as a scientific fact. The idea of racial inferiority was created to justify unequal treatment. Belief in racial inferiority is not what triggered unequal treatment, nor was fear of difference. As Ta-Nehisi Coates said, "But race is a child of racism, not the father." He means that first we exploited people for their resources, not according to how they looked. Exploitation came first, and then the ideology of unequal races to justify this exploitation followed. Similarly, historian Ibram Kendi, in his National Book Award-winning Stamped from the Beginning, explains, "The beneficiaries of slavery, segregation, and mass incarceration have produced racist ideas of black people being best suited for or deserving of the confines of slavery, segregation, or the jail cell. Consumers of these racist ideas have been led to believe there is something wrong with Black people, and not the politics that have enslaved, oppressed, and confined so many Black people. Kendi goes on to argue that if we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity in condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination. The perception of race. Race is an evolving social idea that was created to legitimize racial inequality and protect white advantage. The term, quote, white, first appeared in colonial law in the late 1600s. By 1790, people were asked to claim their race on the census, and by 1825, the perceived degree of blood determined who would be classified as Indian. From the late 1800s through the early 20th century, as waves of immigrants entered the United States, the concept of a white race was solidified. When slavery in the United States was abolished in 1865, whiteness remained profoundly important as legalized racist exclusion and violence against African Americans continued in new forms. To have citizenship and the rights citizenship embodied, you had to be legally classified as white. People with non-white racial classifications began to petition the courts to be reclassified. Now the courts were in the position to decide who was white and who was not. For example, Armenians won their case to be reclassified as white with the help of a scientific witness who claimed that they were scientifically, quote, Caucasian. In 1922, the Supreme Court ruled that the Japanese could not be legally white because they were scientifically classified as Mongoloid. A year later, the court stated that Asian Indians were not legally white, even though they were also scientifically classified as, quote, Caucasian. To justify these contradictory rulings, the court stated that being white was based on the common understanding of the white man. In other words, people already seen as white got to decide who was white. The metaphor of the United States is the great melting pot in which immigrants from around the world come together and melt into one unified society through the process of assimilation is a cherished idea. Once new immigrants learn English and adapt to the American culture and customs, they become Americans. In reality, only European immigrants were allowed to melt or assimilate into dominant culture in the 19th and 20th centuries because, regardless of their ethnic identities, these immigrants were perceived to be white and thus could belong. Race is a social construction, and thus who is included in the category of white changes over time. As the Italian-American man from my workshop noted, European ethnic groups such as Irish, Italian, and Polish were excluded in the past, but where they may have been originally divided in terms of origin, European immigrants became racially united through assimilation. This process of assimilation, speaking English, eating, quote, American foods, discarding customs that set them apart, redefined the perception of American as white. Racial identification in the larger society plays a fundamental role in identity development and how we see ourselves. If we, quote, look white, we are treated as white in a society at large. For example, people of Southern European heritage, such as Spanish or Portuguese, or from the former Soviet Union, especially if they are new immigrants or were raised by immigrants, are likely to have a stronger sense of ethnic identity than will someone of the same ethnicity whose ancestors have been here for generations. Yet, although their internal identity may be different, if they, quote, pass as white, they will still have a white experience externally. If they look white, the default assumption will be that they are white, and thus they will be responded to as white. The incongruity between their internal ethnic identity, ergo Portuguese, Spanish, and external racial experience, ergo white, would provide a more complex or nuanced sense of identity than that of someone who doesn't have a strong ethnic identity. However, they are still granted white status and the advantages that come with that status. Today, these advantages are de facto rather than de jure. but are nonetheless powerful in shaping our daily lives. It is on each of us who passes white to identify how these advantages shape us, not to deny them whole scale. Because race is a product of social forces, it has also manifested itself along class lines. Poor and working class people were not always perceived as fully white. In a society that grants fewer opportunities to those not seen as white, economic and racial forces are inseparable. However, poor and working class whites are eventually granted full entry into whiteness as a way to exploit labor. If poor whites were focused on feeling superior to those below them in status, they were less focused on those above. The poor and working classes, if united across race, could be a powerful force. But racial divisions have served to keep them from organizing against the owning class who profits from their labor. Still, although working class whites experience classism, they aren't also experiencing racism. I grew up in poverty and I felt a deep sense of shame about being poor, but I also knew that I was white and that it was better to be white. Racism. To understand racism, we need to first distinguish it from mere prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is prejudgment about another person based on the social groups to which that person belongs. Prejudice consists of thoughts and feelings, including stereotypes, attitudes, and generalizations that are based on little or no experience and then are projected onto everyone from that group. Our prejudices tend to be shared because we swim in the same cultural water and absorb the same messages. All humans have prejudice. We cannot avoid it. If I am aware that a social group exists, I will have gained information about that group from the society around me. This information helps me make sense of the group from my cultural framework. People who claim not to be prejudiced are demonstrating a profound lack of self-awareness. Ironically, they are also demonstrating the power of socialization. We have all been taught in schools, through movies, and from family members, teachers, and clergy that it is important not to be prejudiced. Unfortunately, the prevailing belief that prejudice is bad causes us to deny its unavoidable reality. Prejudice is foundational to understanding white fragility because suggesting that white people have racial prejudice is perceived as saying that we are bad and should be ashamed. We then feel the need to defend our character rather than explore the inevitable racial prejudices we have absorbed so that we might change them. In this way, our misunderstanding about what prejudice is protects us. Discrimination is action based on prejudice. These actions include ignoring, exclusion, threats, ridicule, slander, and violence. For example, if hatred is the emotion we feel because of our prejudice, extreme acts of discrimination, such as violence, may follow. These forms of discrimination are generally clear and recognizable. But if what we feel is more subtle, such as mild discomfort, the discrimination is likely to be subtle, even hard to detect. Most of us can acknowledge that we do feel some unease about certain groups of people, if only a heightened sense of self-consciousness. But this feeling doesn't come naturally. Our unease comes from living separate from a group of people while simultaneously absorbing incomplete or erroneous information about them. When the prejudice causes me to act differently, I am less relaxed around you, or I avoid interacting with you. I am now discriminating. Prejudice also manifests itself in action because the way I see the world drives my actions in the world. Everyone has prejudice, and everyone discriminates. Given this reality, inserting the qualifier reverse is nonsensical. When a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it is transformed into racism. I want to read that again, that's pretty powerful. When a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it is transformed into racism. a far-reaching system that functions independently from the intentions of self-images or individual actors. J. Kahalani Kawanui, professor of American Studies and Anthropology at Wesleyan University, explains racism is a structure, not an event. American women's struggles for suffrage illustrates how institutional power transforms prejudice and discrimination into structures of oppression. Everyone has prejudice and discriminates, but structures of oppression go well beyond individuals. While women could be prejudiced and discriminate against men in individual interactions, women as a group could not deny men their civil rights. But men as a group could and did deny women their civil rights. Men could do so because they controlled all the institutions. Therefore, the only way women could gain suffrage was for men to grant it to them. Women could not grant suffrage to themselves. Similarly, racism, like sexism and other forms of oppression, occurs when a racial group's prejudice is backed by legal authority and institutional control. This authority and control transforms individual prejudices into a fear-reaching system that no longer depends on the good intentions of individual actors. It becomes the default of the society and is reproduced automatically. Racism is a system. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that intersection of race and gender in this example of suffrage. White men granted suffrage to women, but only granted full access to white women. Women of color were denied full access until the Voting Rights Act of 1964. The system of racism begins with ideology, which refers to the big ideas that are reinforced throughout society. From birth, we are conditioned into accepting and not questioning these ideas. Ideology is reinforced across society. For example, in schools and in textbooks, political speeches, movies, advertising, holiday celebrations, and words and phrases. These ideas are also reinforced through social penalties when someone questions an ideology and through the limited availability of alternative ideas. Ideologies are the frameworks through which we are taught to represent, interpret, understand, and make sense of social existence. Because these ideas are constantly reinforced, they are very hard to avoid believing and internalizing. Examples of ideology in the United States include individualism, the superiority of capitalism as an economic system, and democracy as a political system, consumerism as a desirable lifestyle, and mediocrity, anyone who can succeed if he or she works hard. I'm sorry, wrong word. Meritocracy, not mediocrity. Meritocracy. Anyone can succeed if he or she works hard. The racial ideology that circulates in the United States rationalizes racial hierarchies as the outcome of a natural order, resulting from the either genetics or individual effort or talent. Those who don't succeed are just not naturally capable, deserving, or hardworking. Ideologies that obscure racism as a system of inequality are perhaps the most powerful racial forces because once we accept our positions within racial hierarchies, these positions seem natural and difficult to question, even when we are disadvantaged by them. In this way, very little external pressure needs to be applied to keep people in their places. Once the rationalizations for inequality are internalized, both sides will uphold the relationship. Racism is deeply embedded in the fabric of society. It is not limited to a single act or person, nor does it move back and forth, one day benefiting whites and another day or even era benefiting people of color. The direction of power between white people and people of color is historic, traditional, and normalized in ideology. Racism differs from individual racial prejudice and racial discrimination in the historical accumulation and ongoing use of institutional power and authority to support the prejudice and to systemically systematically enforce discriminatory behaviors with far-reaching effects. People of color may also hold prejudices and discriminate against white people, but they lack the social and institutional power that transforms their prejudice and discrimination into racism. The impact of their prejudice on whites is temporary and contextual. Whites hold the social and institutional positions in society to infuse their racial prejudice into laws, policies, practices, and norms of society in a way that people of color do not. A person of color may refuse to wait on me if I enter a shop, but people of color cannot pass legislation that prohibits me and everyone like me from buying a home in a certain neighborhood. People of color may also hold prejudices and discriminate against their own and other groups of color, but this bias ultimately holds them down and in this way reinforces the system of racism that still benefits whites. Racism is a society-wide dynamic that occurs at the group level. When I say that only whites can be racist, I mean that in the United States, only whites have the collective, social, and institutional power and privilege over people of color. People of color do not have the power and privilege over white people. Many whites see racism as a thing of the past, and of course, we are well served not to acknowledge it in the present. Yet, racial disparity between whites and people of color continues to exist in every institution across society, and in many cases, it's increasing rather than decreasing. Although segregation may make these disparities difficult for whites to see and easy to deny, racial disparities and their effects on overall quality of life have been extensively documented by a wide range of agencies. Among those documenting these challenges are the U.S. Census Bureau, the United Nations, academic groups such as UCLA Civil Rights Project and the Metropolis Project, and nonprofits such as NAACP and the Anti-Defamation League. Scholar Marilyn Frye uses the metaphor of a birdcage to describe the interlocking forces of oppression. If you stand close to a birdcage and press your face against the wires, your perceptions of the bars will disappear and you will have an almost unobstructed view of the bird. If you turn your head to examine one wire of the cage closely, you will not be able to see the other wires. If your understanding of the cage is based on the myopic view, you may not understand why the bird doesn't just go around the single wire and fly away. You might even assume that the bird liked or chose its place in the cage. But if you stepped back and took a wider view, you would begin to see that the wires come together in an interlocking pattern, a pattern that works to hold the bird firmly in place. It now becomes clear that a network of systematically related barriers surround the bird. Taken individually, none of these barriers would be that difficult for the bird to get around. But because they interlock with each other, they thoroughly restrict the bird. While some birds may escape from the cage, most will not. And certainly those that do escape will have to navigate many barriers that birds outside the cage do not. The birdcage metaphor helps us understand why racism can be hard to see and recognize. We have a limited view. Without recognizing how our position in relation to the bird defines how much of the cage we can see, we rely on single situations and expectations and anecdotal evidence for our understanding rather than on broader, interlocking patterns. Although there are always exceptions, the patterns are consistent and well documented. People of color are confined and shaped by forces and barriers that are not accidental, occasional, or avoidable. These forces are systematically related to each other in ways that restrict their movement. Individual whites may be, quote, against racism, but they still benefit from a system that privileges whites as a group. David Wellman succinctly summarizes racism as, quote, a system of advantage based on race. These advantages are referred to as white privilege, a sociological concept referring to advantages that are taken for granted by whites and that cannot be similarly enjoyed by people of color in the same context. quote, government, community, workplaces, schools, etc. But let me be clear, stating that racism privileges whites does not mean that individual white people do not struggle or face barriers. It does mean that we do not face the particular barriers of racism. As with prejudice and discrimination, we can remove the qualifier reverse from any discussion of racism. By definition, racism is a deeply embedded historical system of institutional power. It is not fluid. It does not change direction simply because a few individuals of color manage to excel. I'm going to go ahead and stop there for part 1 of chapter 2, and I will post part 2 in a few minutes.